Hi, I'm Jacqueline Smith, and for my second case study, I'll be talking about the fire collapse escape. So, looking at the background of the case, on July 22nd, 1975, Stanley Foreman, who was a photographer for the Boston Herald at the time, raced to the scene of an apartment fire after hearing it on a police scanner. So, Foreman says that once he got to the scene, he actually saw someone go down an alley carrying a ladder, so he immediately started to follow. And he came upon two girls trapped on the fire escape of the fifth floor of the building. And as you can see kind of on the bottom here on the left, that's Foreman who was capturing all this. And then on the bottom right, you can see the two girls on the fire escape, and you can see they're with firefighter Robert O'Neill, and he's trying to get them safely on this ladder. But unfortunately, before he could get them on the ladder, the fire escape actually collapsed and the two girls fell to the ground. Robert O'Neill was actually hanging onto the ladder, so he did not fall. So the two girls were 2-year-old Tiara Jones and her godmother, 19-year-old Diana Bryan. And while the two were falling, Foreman was capturing this. He actually was taking photos already while they were up there, but then once they began to fall, he just so happened to get more photos of the incident. Bryant, the 19-year-old, she suffered multiple head and body injuries and she died hours later. And then Jones, the 2-year-old, she actually fell on top of Bryant, so she did survive. The next day, the Boston Herald did publish the tragic photo of the two falling on the front page, and then the Associated Press had also given the pictures worldwide distribution. So you can see here, this photo was just as the fire escape began to fall, and you can see how they begin to fall down. And then this photo is definitely the most famous one that came out of the incident. It struck controversy amongst the country, and for years, I mean, it's 40 years later, and we're still talking about it. So after releasing this photo, newspapers and magazines all over the world were publishing it. Foreman, the photographer, actually won a Pulitzer Prize, and the photo received Photo of the Year by the national press. But after this photo was released, within 24 hours of releasing it, Boston took action to improve inspection and maintenance of all fire escapes. So even though this photo was released, it struck something amongst the city that a change needed to be made. The fact that this fire escape broke, and that's what killed the two girls, not the fire itself. I'm sorry, only one girl did die, the 19-year-old, but the fact that it broke because of the escape and not because of the fire, that really struck amongst the city. So after we kind of looked at the background of the case, I want to talk about the ethical problem. Obviously, the issue is that this photo here was published, and the question is that ethical that it was published, that something so tragic was spread across the world? I wanted to kind of look at it at two different perspectives. So first is kind of the emotional perspective. So this image is capturing a woman just seconds before her death. It is a very private moment because they're falling, it's such a tragedy. And the question is it respectful that we are capturing this image? And then this graphic photo can be offensive and uncomfortable for viewers. So not only for these two girls, but the audience, the people that are viewing it, the whole world. It is very uncomfortable to see something like this happening, especially when it's two girls and one of them is only 2 years old. And then looking at it from a journalistic perspective, though, it's a little bit different. You see it as this photo did influence the improvement of fire escapes across the country, which is something positive that did come out of this. And then Foreman, the photographer, he was doing his job as a photojournalist. He was seeking the truth and reporting it. This wasn't planned for him, obviously. He wasn't anticipating this in the slightest, but it did happen, and he did report it to the public. So looking at the effects of the case, the photo was published worldwide, and kind of understanding the audience for this case is basically the world, basically anyone that saw it, which was a very large amount of people. And the initial responses were negative. People were very appalled that such a private photo be published. There were tear sheets on the photos from 128 U.S. papers in several foreign countries, so it became worldwide. And like I said, now here we are, and we're still talking about it. It's a very, very historical photo. So looking at the values involved, first I wanted to look at the values of Bryant and Jones, the two girls. So the two girls photographed during such a tragic time do deserve a value of respect. And the question is it respectful that such a tragic moment was internationally published? I believe that even though this photograph was spread so publicly, people still took the time to mourn the tragedy and give their condolences. It's not as if, this happened and people were happy about it or they were laughing at it or anything like that. People were very, very saddened by this. This was a very sad thing, and people were mourning their loss in this tragedy. But it just so happened that the whole world was, and it wasn't just the families. The whole world was understanding that what had happened. So the question is, did these girls receive respect? And I believe they did. It is, I understand, a very tragic thing that did happen, and it would be different if these photos were taken out of, if he had known that this was going to happen and he started taking photos, but by accident these photos were taken. And so I think even though they were published, these two girls were respected, and the whole world was able to, mourn such a tragedy that they suffered through. Now looking at the values of the public. Does the public have the right to know if a fire escape has broken and killed one person and the other suffered injuries? And I believe, yes, obviously the public does have the value of citizenship. By seeing this image and being made aware of what happened, the public can make changes that will better benefit the community and prevent this incident from occurring again. So the question which I asked myself, was, would this story itself have been just as powerful without the actual picture? And I believe no. Even though, if we'd still read this story, we would have been very sad by this. It would have been horrible to read, but to actually see it, humans, we are influenced much more by visuals than by words. So by actually seeing it happen, we're more moved by it. And then also when you see something like this visually, you see a photograph of this, we have a sense of guilt and we want to make a change to prevent that from ever happening again. It's instinctual for us to make it better. And if we had just read this happening, we wouldn't have had that guilt as much to make such a change. And then also I wanted to look at the values of the photographer Stanley Forman. So his values, he has a loyalty to the public and to the Boston Herald. His job as a journalist is to inform the public. So if that photo had not been published, chances are people would not have been moved enough to put the effort toward improving fire escapes. And he did not choose to photograph the girls once they had fallen. If he had chosen to do that, that would have totally been unethical to take photos of them in such a horrible, they're physically and visibly injured. That would have been unethical. But he does have a loyalty to the public, and so by taking these photos and giving them to the public, he's doing his job as a journalist. And then this was a quote he had said in an interview I read. He said, "It was a routine rescue that went bad. Everyone was going to get out, and then all of a sudden, everything just went to hell. I don't have a crystal ball. You get there, you don't want anything bad to happen." So obviously he wasn't anticipating this, but it did happen. And then I actually did want to read a quote that Jay Rosen said in his book, What Are Journalists For? He said, "To tell the truth, you need a tough hide. Journalists have to steel themselves for their daily battles against the truth shaders, stonewallers, and sentimentalizers." So he's kind of just saying how journalists do have to have a tough shell because people do have very negative feedbacks, but at the end of the day, the journalist's job is to report to the public. So now kind of applying ethical principles to this case. I wanted to look at John Stuart Mill's liberal theory. So his liberal theory expresses the idea that the press is a free marketplace of ideas, and Stephen Ward talks about this theory a bit more in his book, The Invention of Journalism Ethics. Ward says that the liberal approach continues to be used to justify arguments for a free press against media restrictions, such as censorship of offensive views and the abuse of libel laws to current publication. Journalists should constitute an independent press that watches and that informs citizens and acts as a watchdog. So in this case, I believe, Forman, the photographer, was being a watchdog. He captured this moment that was, very tragic, but he gave it to the public because it was something they needed to be aware of, regardless of, if it was offensive or if it should have been censored. He gave it to the public. So in this case, he was acting as that watchdog. And the liberal theory further supports that it was ethical for Forman to publish these photos. And then, of course, if you're going to talk about Mill, you have to talk about the principle of utility. So the principle of utility says that an action is permissible if and only if the consequences of that action are at least as good as those of any other action available to the agent. So in this case, by publishing the picture, there's a greater amount of good done. Yes, those girls were captured in such a tragic incident, but at the same time, you have to look at so much good that was done because fire escapes were improved across the country. And not only the fact that fire escapes were improved, but also people developed more of a fire safety plan, because when you see something like this happen, obviously your first instinct is you don't want that to happen to you. And so, unfortunately, because that's how humans think, and so that was spread across the country. And so in this case, the greatest happiness was made. It created the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So I wanted to kind of tie up loose ends by answering some of these questions. So one question is, should the victims of tragedy have protection from being photographed? And yes, I absolutely think they do. But at the same time, in this case, Foreman, the photographer, did not know exactly what he was capturing. He did not know that these girls were going to fall. He was just taking pictures. And then once he said that once he realized they were falling, he actually looked away because he didn't want to see them hit the ground. And obviously, like I said, if he had taken photos of them fall, or like actually when they had fallen, that is completely unethical, because they have these physical, visible injuries, and that would not be okay. But since he just accidentally captured this moment, then I believe it's okay. But in the most part, people obviously victims of tragedy do have some form of protection, and there does need to be a sense of respect. So did the newspaper sensationalize the photo by its size or placement? And they didn't. They did what was appropriate for the photo. The photo was actually, for the Boston Herald, it was on the first page of the newspaper, and it was an 11 and a half by 16 and a half inches. So it was very large. And I think that's appropriate. If it had been smaller and kind of pushed to the back a few pages, that would not have been appropriate for this image. This is such a strong image. If it's going to be published, it needs to be published like in a proper way on the front page in larger size. If it's smaller, then it's kind of saturating the meaning of the image and the statement that it's making. And then, is the repair of aging fire escapes a morally justifiable reason for running the photos? And yes, I think so, because, like I said, it's going back to the principle of utility. You have the greatest number of happiness for the greatest number of people. And then, was the ethical reasoning for other newspapers, or what is the ethical reasoning for other newspapers to run the photos? And I think that is the same. I mean, obviously, the Boston Herald ran this because it's local news and the community need to be aware of this apartment fire, but newspapers across the country, also people were able to be aware that fire escapes obviously are very important, and it is important that they are structured well enough so that in times when they are used, this doesn't happen again. And then, should one person's calamity be a photojournalist's good fortune? Yes, Foreman did win a Pulitzer Prize, and this did receive Photo of the Year, but I don't look at it as that. I'm not defending the publication of this photo because of what he received. I'm defending it because it improved fire escapes across the country, and it was able to further prevent this incident that unfortunately was already going to happen. So the fact that it happened and it was captured in a way that prevented it from happening again, I say that that is okay, and that makes it ethical. So just concluding my argument, I do believe that this was ethical for these photographs to be published, because there was something positive that came out of them. I certainly believe that victims of tragedy do have a form of protection, but in this case, when something just accidentally, the picture was taken without anyone really anticipating what was going to happen, I do think it is important that the public is made aware of it in order to prevent it from occurring again. So thank you for watching.